Baruch. It's the most common word that you'll find in all of our blessings. It is the word that starts all of our blessings. How does Sidur Lev Shalem, the Sidur that we use in the sanctuary, translate the word Baruch when we are beginning or ending a blessing? And. It doesn't. See, if you look in Sidur Lev Shalem, and I'll open the door later if you want to go double check this for me, it does not translate the word Baruch when it comes as part of Baruch Atah Adonai for the beginning or end of a particular section of the service. The translators in the intro basically say, we give up. There is no way to render this word into elegant English that will capture everything this word is supposed to mean. Which seems a little strange, because first of all, they have no problem translating it when it comes elsewhere within a section of the service. And second of all, as you guys all just mentioned, it's got a perfectly serviceable English translation. Blessed. You know, what's the problem here? Well, the problem here is essentially grammar meeting theology. When we say Baruch Atah Adonai, if we're going to go for a strictly, quote, literal translation, how would we translate those three words? All right, Baruch, blessed. Atah, you. And who is the you that we're addressing? Adonai, God. So, blessed are you, Adonai. Or blessed are you, Adonai. English is a little funny on how we pronounce this word. We'll maybe come back to that topic in a minute. So, Baruch Atah Adonai, blessed are you, Adonai.
Wouldn't Baruch be present tense?
Baruch is not present tense. Thank you for getting to my grammar point. Baruch is actually an adjective. It's an adjective. It'd be like saying, Gadol, you're big or great, God. You are blessed, God. Now, adjectives are always tricky when it comes to God in the first place. Because when we slap an adjective onto God, we act like it's the same thing as when we put an adjective onto a person, onto the table, onto a drink. It's a cold cup, it's a small table, it's a short person. So, adjectives seem like they are just descriptors of a person. But theologically, that's problematic when we come to God, because to attach labels to God, to attach a term to God that seems to be describing an aspect of God can be theologically uncomfortable, because it makes it feel like there are divisions within God. That this part of God is colored this, and that part is shaped like this, and that concept of God is very difficult within Jewish theology. We do not like to dismember God into constituent pieces because we hold that you cannot do that. But there is an even bigger problem when we get to the word Baruch. The other adjectives we can excuse as being signposts indicating towards God, using familiar phrasing that we humans are used to. But Baruch, blessed, seems incredibly counterintuitive. If I were to tell you that John is blessed, what would that mean? He's in God's favor, right? He's got the good life. Something is going on well for him. And indeed, we wish the adjective blessed towards people all the time. One of the most famous phrases in all of Torah that is used all the time is Yivarechecha, Adonai v'yishmerecha. And that Yivarechecha means, may God bless you. Okay, and we ask for those blessings in multiple places. Blessings generally mean that something beneficial has happened to the person. It could be a blessing of health. It could be a blessing of wisdom. It could be a blessing of parnasa, of providing for yourself. There are many different types of blessings. What happens, though, to God in that kind of arrangement? Is God waiting to be healthier? Is God going to be richer? How would God be blessed? To be blessed in the usual meaning of the word means that you were deficient and now you're better off than you were. Right? That's what to be blessed is. Or you are currently being good, and if the blessing were removed, you would become less than you currently are. Well, can God be better or worse than God currently is? Theologically, no. Yes, we may sort of talk about things like that just to help the human mind wrap itself around the complexity of God, or really in this case, the simple unity of God, which is beyond our comprehension. But in reality, God does not change. God is not going to shift. God does not get better or worse. God is God in the story. So what do we do with this Baruch? And why did it become, if it's so problematic grammatically and theologically, why did it become this phrase that is at the start of all of our tefillot, of all of our prayers? Well, that was a rhetorical question, because we're going to look into our tradition to try and unpack this. That's why I make handouts, right? Just so that you always remember that whatever I'm saying, just following up from my sermon earlier, it's not just Rabbi Neely's ideas. Right? I do actually have citations. Citations are good. I'm a guy that likes footnotes. Okay, so first we're going to look at the cases where we talk about God being Baruch, applying that adjective to God, found in the Tanakh. So let's go ahead and start here in Genesis 24, where we get the servant of Abraham, who is off trying to find a bride for Isaac, and he offers up the following declaration. He bowed low to the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, Baruch Adonai, Elohei Adoni Abraham. Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not withheld his steadfast faithfulness from my master. For I have been guided on my errand by the Lord to the house of my master's kinsman." So, is God better now than he used to be because of the blessing of Abraham's servant? Has God improved? Doesn't really feel like that, right? He's not saying, now God, now you're rocking because I have given you a blessing. That doesn't work. What does he seem to be saying here? He's thanking God for blessing him. Right? He's calling God the one blessed, but really what he's saying is, God has blessed me by enabling me to come to this point, and God has continued his blessings of Abraham and his household by allowing this to continue, to arrange for the proper match for Isaac. This is the first Baruch Adonai. You will notice there is no Atah. Right? Well, it's not the first Baruch. We get another one from Melchizedek earlier on, but there it's not so much Adonai as El Elyon and Shaddai and other appellations for God. So this is where we are first getting the phrasing. But you're on the right track where when we look through the Tanakh, finding the precise phrase Baruch Atah Adonai is going to be a bit of a tricky thing. And so here you're absolutely right that this is one of the earliest incarnations of a blessing formula that is very similar to what we eventually get in our own blessings with Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. And as such, we are going to have to continue to dig to see how ours grows up. All right, so let's move on to Psalm 100. One of my favorite psalms, one of the daily ones. Raise a shout for the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord in gladness. Come into his presence with shouts of joy. Acknowledge that the Lord is God. Lord here on the caps is Adonai. He made us and we are his people, the flock he tends. Enter his gates with praise, his courts with acclamation. Praise him, Baruch Shemo. Bless his name. For the Lord is good, his steadfast love is eternal, his faithfulness is for all generations. All right, so again, we're getting the basic root word here of bless, Baruch. Here it's in the imperative form, grammar words, right? Gotta love them. Giving us the order that we should bless God. Indeed, this is the same form that we use for the Baruch Hu, right? Give blessing to God. So what are we supposed to be doing based upon the rest of this psalm? What is the attitude of the psalmist here? And what is he telling us our attitude towards God should be in this usage of the word Baruch or bless? It sounds like praise, right? It's saying God is incredible. And we're not necessarily saying God has done a whole lot of things for us, like we had in the Genesis quote. Here it's more like saying God is just outstanding because God is God. And God made us, and therefore we are obligated to give praise to God. And if you look in many older Siddurim, mid-20th century, you'll find that oftentimes the word Baruch is translated as praised. And that became very common in the mid-20th century as a translation to avoid the conundrum of bless. There are problems with that, as we're going to see, however. It's not a perfect translation, which is why Lev Shalem just threw up their hands and said we're going to leave it as the word Baruch, untranslated. But here we seem to be having an element of celebrate or acclaim or declare God's amazingness. And that seems to be where the Baruch is coming from. It's not that God is better off than God was before our statement. It's we are acknowledging that God is simply outstanding. All right, let's take a look now at Psalm 119. I have turned to you with all my heart. Do not let me stray from your commandments. In my heart I treasure your promise. Therefore I do not sin against you. Baruch atah Adonai lamdeni chukecha. Blessed are you, O Lord. Train me in your laws. All right. Bing, bing, bing. We finally hit Baruch atah Adonai. But what is the psalmist saying here? Teach me. Right? It is a petition. It is a request. It is saying, God, you are the source of knowledge and of wisdom. You are the source of all that is good in the world. Can I have some of that? And in particular in this passage, your laws, your ways. I want to live a good life, and I need you to instruct me, to guide me on that path. Therefore, Baruch atah Adonai. Therefore you are blessed. Therefore you are praised. See, it's not quite fitting. It does not map beautifully into English, which is, again, why Lev Shalem did what they did in their translation, or lack of translation on this phrase. Trying to come up with a single English word or phrase to capture all of the emotions within this word Baruch is simply impossible in English. And for the record, it's impossible in Hebrew as well, unless you actually sit and think about it. Just like in English, where many words will have many different variances to them and meaning to them and equivocations, you need to unwrap them. The closest I can come in English, if you want a similar word which can mean both that which is and that which receives, might be the word just. If I say the ruling of the court was just, what am I saying? It was correct. It was full of justice. It was right. It was an accurate ruling. If I say the judge is just, is the judge an accurate ruling? Did the court make the judge? No, the judge makes the ruling. You can begin to see something that we're going to unpack here of this reciprocal relationship. All right. Now let's get down to something very appropriate for our current Torah reading and the longest usage of this phrase, and perhaps the one that will get us furthest along. So here we are from, that's 1 Chronicles 29. I thought I put the first in there. King David said to the entire gathering, God has chosen my son Solomon alone, an untried lad, although the work to be done is vast. For the birah is not for a man, but for the Lord God. What is birah? Those of you who came from Purim? Shushan HaBirah. Right? Shushan HaBirah. Birah is usually translated to city, but really more like the temple precincts is what's being used here. So it's not just the temple, it's the temple project. The monumental architecture might be another way to put it in English. So King David is trying to tell the people, I'm not going to build the temple, Solomon's going to build the temple, but you're all going to be working together. The people rejoiced over their free will offerings they made, for with a whole heart they made free will offerings to the Lord. King David also rejoiced very much. Vayivarech David, and David blessed, Baruch atah Adonai Elohei Yisrael, Avinu me'olam ve'ad olam. David blessed the Lord in front of all the assemblage, and David said, Blessed are you, Lord God of Israel, our Father from eternity to eternity. Yours, Lord, are greatness, might, splendor, triumph, and majesty. Yes, all that is in heaven and on earth. To you, Lord, belong kingship and preeminence above all. Riches and honor are yours to dispense. You have dominion over all. With you are strength and might, and it is your power to make anyone great and strong. Now, God, we praise you and extol your glorious name. All right. Thank you, David, for actually giving us more words than just a single sentence and pulling together everything that biblical Hebrew means when it says, Baruch atah Adonai. Because we see all the elements that we have touched on so far here. First, there is thanks. Thank you, God, for what you have done for me, for my family, for my nation. We also see praise. God, you are the most amazing thing ever. And we also see petition. God, please, we know that you can make those that are weak strong, that you can make the people be able to succeed, that is in your storehouse, if you will, to dispense upon the world, that you are the source of what we call blessing. So this word Baruch is really something that is, when talking about God, used very differently than we talk about human beings. When we talk about human beings as Baruch, we are talking about the target of all of what God is described as doing here. When we talk about God with the word Baruch, we are talking about the source of all that does this. It is like trying to describe the river Nile. Do you mean the delta, or do you mean the headwaters? It's all the same river, but it's a very different relationship depending upon where you stand on that stream. If you're at the downstream point, humans, then you are receiving the flow. And if you are in the headwaters at the top of the Nile, then you are dispensing, you are pushing the water out in order that it flow into the world. Baruch atah Adonai, you are the headwaters of life, and we are at the delta receiving your flow. That is the nutshell, that's why I call these nutshells, of the concept of Baruch atah Adonai. You all with me? Good. Now we get to take it apart because there's more to it than that we need to understand. So first of all, let's take a look into Talmud, because I can't do a teaching without touching on Talmud at least a little. Rav said, any blessing that does not mention God's name is not a blessing. Meaning that if you're going to make a statement as a blessing of God, if you're going to be making a statement of praise of God, of petition of God, then, or thanks of God, then you have to actually include Adonai. And if you don't include Adonai, then it's not actually a formal bracha, that word needs to be in there. And indeed, if we do not use God's name, according to Jewish law, it does not count as a blessing. I mean, as a formal blessing, because we do not take God's name lightly. And so if you wanted to say something that, wow, it's great, then just leave out Adonai and you're fine. You can make the same statement without Adonai without worrying that you've said a bracha inappropriately, what's called a bracha levatala. But Rabbi Yochanan said, any blessing that does not mention God's sovereignty is not a blessing. We haven't touched on this explicitly yet, but the second half of the Baruch atah Adonai is Eloheinu melech ha'olam. And there's God's rulership, God's sovereignty. Because you are our God, we are accepting God's sovereignty upon us. It's not just that Thor was the god of the Norse. That's a descriptive statement. It is Adonai is our God. It is an accepting statement that we accept that God is our God, and therefore we will follow God's direction, namely the Torah. And Melech HaOlam, we also make the statement that sovereignty extends beyond us to the entirety of the world, space, time, infinity, all that good stuff.
Yeah, well, doesn't David say that from eternity to eternity?
Absolutely right. In David's statement back in Chronicles, he is giving more of this whole structure. It hasn't become the formal formula that we're used to, but it encapsulates the same concept. When he describes that you are our God of Israel, our Father, that is accepting God as our leader, and that this is for all time. Ad olam, that this is an eternal position. It's not just we're following God until something better comes along. Which, remember, that was the ancient method, right? If you would eventually, change in your gods if something better came along, usually in the form of a more powerful army that just kicked your nation down the hierarchy. Okay, so with that in mind, now we get into Sefer HaChinuch, one of the great compilations of Jewish thought and practice from the Middle Ages. The words of people and all their deeds, whether good or bad, will not add or subtract from God. Right? There's nothing we can say and nothing we can do for either good or bad that will change God. We cannot make God greater than God is. We cannot make God less than God is by our behavior or by our words. You must understand, despite our always saying, "Blessed are you, God, Baruch atah Adonai," this is not to add blessing to the one who needs no addition. So he's wrestling with the same question we are, and saying just because we say Baruch atah, and it sounds like we are saying God should be blessed, the same way that we say our children should be blessed, we may be asking for a bonus for our kids, but we're not really asking for a bonus for God, because God can have no bonus because he can't get better than God. God is not deficient in any way. God is the master over everything and over all the blessing. God moves all that exists and created humanity and put them in control over the earth and over everything that is in it. It is from God's traits, an abundance of kindness and the desire for the good of his creatures, that God wants humanity to be fitting and to merit to receive goodness. So God is the source of all blessing, and therefore we shall say that the matter of the blessing that we say is only a mention to arouse ourselves through the words of our mouths that God is the blessed one, and the blessed one that contains all that is good. Through this rousing of ourselves and the focus of our thoughts to acknowledge that all that is good is included in God, and God is the ruler over us, to send us to all that God desires. We merit, through this good action, to bring his blessings upon us. Okay, I know the translation of a medieval text is not always very self-explanatory, but what he is trying to say here is that by saying Baruch atah Adonai, by putting ourselves in that state of mindfulness, that moment of kavanah, of intentionality before we do whatever the blessing goes on to talk about, or consider the topic of the blessing as it goes on, that what we are trying to remind ourselves is of that river analogy that I used earlier, that God is the headwaters of all. We should not look at our blessings as saying, God, I really hope you get a gold star, because you know what? You made apples, and apples are pretty cool. That's not what we're doing. We are saying, I'm about to eat an apple, but before I do, I am going to consider the fact that this apple, and every apple, and in fact everything in the entire universe, from my breath to the world around me, to the stars above, all flow from that same source, from God. That is the source of all blessing. Baruch atah Adonai. I may be focused on an apple, but I am looking through the apple to see God. You are the source of everything. Exactly. And that is the intention of having this phrase, that we should be able to recreate within our minds those words of David, not verbatim, you don't worry about memorizing it, but the feeling that David had as he stands there, looking out at his family, at the kingdom, and at the potential for the next generation, and to realize all of this is thanks to God. And then he throws in this additional layer. And by doing so, we then we prepare ourselves to receive the actual blessing. So we are saying that God is the source of blessing, so that we will then live and act with that knowledge in a way that is righteous and good, so that then we will deserve to actually be blessed. So this is not just a case of, great job, God, you're amazing, you're the source of all. It's, if God is amazing and the source of all, then maybe I should actually be living my life in a way that reflects that awareness. And lo and behold, when I do, my life gets better. That there's actually a transformative element to this. It is not merely stating a catechism, that this is meant to be a self-affirmational phrase that will transform the way we look at life and live our life, so that our life will be able to receive the blessings that it is God's nature to want for all of his creation. But we have to actually open ourselves to that. We have to open ourselves to that. We have to frame our mind in such a way that that can occur, or else we will either not notice it or not be the recipient. Question, comment?
If we receive all of this from God, and we're responsible to God
Mm-hmm.
for all of this, then I'm thinking about climate change and the destruction that we cause. How do we balance that with God?
We're messing up. So yes, when we are considering these things, I mean, again, from the act of I'm about to eat an apple, and so I'm saying Baruch atah Adonai about the Berei Peri Ha'etz, the one that created the fruit of the tree, I should be looking at this apple and not just saying, wow, God did a good job on the apple. I should be reflecting on, am I living in a way that recognizes the miracle of the gift of this apple and all that God has given me? And if the answer is no, then I should be behaving differently. Every time we say a blessing, it's not just a chance for gratitude and thanks. It's a chance for self-reflection to make sure we're living up to what that blessing means in its most fundamental reality of the universe and our relationship to God. And if we look around and realize that we are messing up parts of our lives, whether it be on the grand scale of how do we run a society or a world, or whether it be on the minor scale of how do I treat the people in my own household, if it does not match the essence of Baruch atah Adonai, then I need to change. And that's a constant aspect of why we say blessings all the time, traditionally 100 blessings a day. We try to fit in one way or another, so that we have those constant reminders of you should be living a life in accordance with what this means. Not just by saying the words, but what does it actually mean? It should be changing you a little each and every time. Okay, onward. You'll notice there are many ellipses on the page. Sefer HaChinuch does not shy away from saying a lot, and I unfortunately had to cut down a lot of what he said to get other things on the page, but I do highly recommend. You can go to Sefaria, look it up. This is mitzvah, 430, and find a lot more that he has to say in those gaps. It comes out, according to this reason, that blessed, Baruch, is an adjective, meaning to say that it is admission to God that God contains all of the blessings. And this is the explanation of may he be blessed. When we say Baruch Hu, Uvaruch Shemo is a very common phrase, blessed he and blessed is his name, that it means to say it should be your will in front of you, meaning should be what God is wanting for the world, that all people of the world will relate all blessings to you, that we will connect every good thing in life to its ultimate source, and admit that everything in the world emanates from you, and that his will be completed, meaning that we actually do what God has asked, as he wants to do good, as we have said, because what God asks of us is good for us. Right? It's not good for God, because God can't have good or bad happen to God, because God is God. What God wants for the world is good for us. We're all good? Okay. From this root that I have said, that the mention of blessed be he, Baruch Hu, is an admission in front of him about all of the blessings, that they are his, and that there is a need to make an admission to him about this at the beginning of the request and at the end, so that one may not be like a slave that took his reward from his master and then left without permission. Wait, what are we talking about? Okay, now we get down to brass tacks. When we are davening from our Sidurim, you may have noticed that there are a lot of Baruch atah Adonais. And you may have noticed sometimes they're followed by Eloheinu melech ha'olam, and sometimes they're not. Well, is there a reason why they are and aren't at different times? Absolutely. So the blessings that we have in our Shacharit service, for example, the blessings that go before and after the Shema, and the blessings that make up the Amidah, are arranged with the Baruch Atahs and their full form or half form, depending upon their juxtaposition. Now the basic rule, as he points out, is that we should begin and end every blessing with Baruch Atah and finish with Baruch Atah. That should be the basic bookends of any engagement of our thought towards God in a blessing form, because we are trying to make sure that we are mindful of this relationship to God and the blessing that's come to us. And if we didn't, then it'd just be like walking up and taking what had been given without actually saying thank you. And that's just rude. Okay, but let's get into the details of how these get arranged then. The difference that our rabbis, may their memory be blessed, fixed for us in the Talmud, Barachot 11a, in the matter of the blessings. That there are some that open with blessed and conclude with bless, and there are those that conclude with it but do not open with it. And there are those that open with it but do not conclude with it, are established according to my opinion, meaning that is a little bit laid out in the Talmud, that some blessings begin Baruch Atah and will finish Baruch Atah. Some blessings just end with a Baruch Atah, and some begin but don't end. Okay, and if you go through our Shacharit service, you'll find examples of these different versions. Any blessing that has a request of something from God or the mention of a miracle that is not next to another blessing opens with blessed and concludes with blessed. For example, who creates the light of the morning prayers, meaning Yotzer Or, and who brings evening, Ma'ariv Aravim, of the evening prayers. If you go and you look at those blessings, which come right after the Baruch Hu in the morning and evening respectively, they will begin with a Baruch Atah, and they finish with a Baruch Atah, unlike the blessings which follow after them, which do not begin with a Baruch Atah. We still with me? Okay. I didn't have time. I didn't have space to fit all of that on one page. And many like them is for the reason mentioned. But any blessing that is next to one that concludes with blessed does not open with blessed. So if the last blessing finishes with a Baruch Atah, the next blessing doesn't have to start with a Baruch Atah. They are chained together because you already finished one that began with a Baruch. And so once you start with the Baruch, as long as you're continuing, you chain them together. You'll still finish with the Baruch Atah, but you don't have to begin each one with a Baruch Atah. Now the most famous example of this is the Amidah. In the Amidah, we have our 7 blessings on Shabbat, and then we have our 19 blessings on weekdays. And the first one begins with a Baruch, and then the other ones do not begin with Baruch, but finish with a Baruch for each of the other blessings. Everyone got a visualization of this? If not, you've got homework now, which is to actually notice what you're davening, or, daven in the first place. Since you acknowledge God and God's sovereignty at the end of the last blessing, it is not fit to repeat the acknowledgement twice at once. You already said it, you don't have to say it again at the start of the next blessing. But it is fitting to conclude with blessed, since he interrupted with the requests of his needs, as it is fit to go back and mention and to give his heart the acceptance of his kingship and his mastery over him. So when you are doing the Amidah, again, as the strongest paradigm of this, you've just mentioned, God, you are amazing, you bring healing to the world, blessed are you, the one who heals the world. And then when you move on to the next blessing, you don't have to start off with the Baruch Atah, because you've already focused on God's essence and God's kingship. But then you start talking about your request, and please bless the year and make it a wonderful year for me. And when you get to the end of that blessing, well, then you do have to loop back around again and Baruch Atah it, so that you are refreshing that focus on God's essence as the source of all blessing and God's rulership of the world and our acceptance of that. And then the next blessing, we can get right into our petition and our description, and then come back and do another Baruch Atah at the end. So this is how it chains it together. It's like, swimming, stroke, stroke, breath, stroke, stroke, breath. Make sense? You don't breathe on every stroke, and you don't stroke without breathing. You have to get a rhythm. Those that deviate from this framework, because there's always exceptions, like the Sheva Brachot, the blessings for the wedding, or Havdalah, or the Kiddush, follow the sages who taught us that sometimes these blessings are said not with the adjacent ones, meaning that sometimes we'll say Borei Pri Hagafen all by itself, and sometimes we'll say Borei Pri Hagafen and then begin the paragraph of the Kiddush, depending upon whether it's Shabbat or a holiday or whether we're just drinking wine. And as such, we're going to we're not going to follow the general rule of chaining blessings together. Why? Because our rabbis did not want to distinguish and say when it comes with adjacent ones, as they always fled from these distinctions in everything that is given over to the hands of the masses, and such is rational, which is a beautiful little dig at people, the common folk, which is to say, okay, yes, you could have taught if it comes right after the other blessing that you've already acknowledged, God's name and God's kingship, then you don't have to begin the Kiddush with the Baruch Atah. But if it doesn't, then you do have to begin with. The rabbis went, no. Ain't no one going to follow that, because you know what happens when you teach this to the regular folk that aren't sitting around studying all the time. They're going to make a mess of it. So since it comes sometimes together, sometimes apart, we're just going to teach one form and use it whether it's together or apart, because that way at least you won't be wrong. So this is a precautionary measure. So when you see deviations from the pattern that was described here, understand that it's not a deep and powerful reason. It is the sages trying to make things easier for the rest of us. Good? I know you probably didn't realize the rabbis were so considerate of the rest of us and the fact that they know that this stuff is complicated and wanted to make sure it was a little bit more attainable. Any blessing that does not have a request for something from God, nor the mention of a miracle for Israel, such as the blessing before food and drink and all the pleasures of the body, they all open with blessed and do not conclude with it. Borei Pri Hagafen. Done. We don't add another Baruch Atah after that. We just say, God, you are the source of all blessing, you are the ruler of all the world, and we accept and acknowledge that. And here's the particular thing that I am focusing on at this moment. Done, drink, or done, eat. Since you mentioned the kingship of God and his mastery and immediately finished your words, it is not obligatory to repeat the mention of blessed a second time, as it would be repetitious. And yes, believe it or not, Judaism does care about being repetitious and does try to avoid it as much as possible. Sometimes it's not as possible as we might like, and that means we need a little bit more time to say it all. But sometimes one sentence does it all. But recognize the saying of brachot, whether it be in our services for Shacharit or the Amidah or Mariv, or whether it be in the blessings for our food or other experiences, are not just meant to be mechanical check marks off of a list. Each one is supposed to be this crack in our life that we look through, peer through, to experience the divine in a way that we don't on a regular basis. That we allow ourselves to think more deeply than just, I like apples, and God made apples, so I like God, but instead recognize that the blessing that we are now experiencing comes from that same source as every other blessing, and indeed all of humanity and all of reality. And I accept that, and I accept the responsibility that comes from that acknowledgement, that insight is meant to lead to an action more than just biting into the apple. That it is meant to be a constant refocusing, rebalancing of our lives so that we have that correct direction, that correct kavanah. All right, that is the end of the presentation, but I imagine you might have your own questions and comments, so I'll open the floor. Yes?
I'm thinking about the root of the word Baruch is meat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Elazar, who made that, one of those original Baruchas, made that covenant by putting his hand under Abraham's knee. So doesn't it apply the concept of a relationship between like a servant and a master, just incorporating the word Baruch, like Baruch itself?
Absolutely. So if we want to get down the linguistic rabbit hole, then yes, the word Baruch comes from Baruch, which is the Hebrew word for knee. And as you mentioned, the Abraham's servant, when he took the oath to Abraham about going off to find a bride, he put his hand under actually Abraham's thigh, which is connected to the knee, perhaps even further up the leg, depending upon the understanding of the ancient custom that was in place at the time. as a sign of, I am swearing by what is most dear. Fill in the blank for yourselves. And the notion being that this was an acceptance of obligation and of commandedness, if you will, of being as deep as possible, the modern equivalent of a pinky swear, if you will. And that notion of the knee as being a reminder of the blessing, a reminder of our subservience, a reminder of our willingness to sublimate our own desires in order to fulfill what God has asked, is absolutely built into this. That's the whole idea of the sermon I was giving about the golden calf before, is that we spend too much of our time doing what the Bible describes as doing what is right in our own eyes, rather than doing what is right in God's eyes. When we say a blessing, when we allow ourselves to bend to God as we are about to either acknowledge some aspect of God, to petition God, or to thank God, we are trying to see the world through God's eyes. And that bending of our will to God, that bending of ourselves to be subservient to God, is exactly tied into that. And yes, I do believe that that's partly why the knee plays a prominent role in the word that was chosen as the anchor for this.
And maybe that's why in the Olenu we bend the knee.
Well, I mean, we bend the knee because it literally says that we bow and we bend. But of course, and this is going to be another tefillah tip coming up, we're also going to talk about what role bowing has in general within Jewish prayer, because that's something else that can be a little bit misunderstood. So I'm going to save a lot of comments about the bowing and prostration and all of that for when we do that session.
I learned something when I was doing junior congregation, and it was Tisa doesn't mean numbering. It means lifting up the chin and looking God face to face. So God wants to know you.
Yes, the word kitisa doesn't mean to literally take. It doesn't mean to literally count. It literally means to lift. And there are many interpretations of why would that be the verb that's being used here when so many other Hebrew words would have seemed more appropriate for either the taking of the half shekel or for the numbering / counting of the population. And the idea of acknowledging, of recognizing is one of those, yes.
Yeah. So it fits in with God.
Any other questions or comments? All right, then we will wrap it up for today. And if people want to hang around for a Birkat Hamazon, we'll get that going just as soon as we've distributed the benchers.